Melanie, thank you so much for joining us. The Zoom is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much, Elise and Dave. I'm really honored to be here and talk about my work. I know that this was kind of the impetus for this symposium, so I'm very excited. And I think I want to start by saying that I recognize that this project is just one small piece of a broader puzzle. And so I'm just so supportive of this symposium and all the different things that we guys are talking about the next couple of days. I think it's so important to be studying this. And so I'm really excited to share, where this started with the recognition that it's a limited first step at looking at remote work and how it affects creativity. Let me share my screen. And 1 second. Oh, when it went away, I'm trying to do, oh, here we go. Okay, does this look good to everyone? Awesome. Okay, so the impetus for this project is not really something we need to justify to any of the people in this room, which is that virtual interaction is the future, right? We knew this before COVID, but COVID has accelerated this adoption of remote work and using different kinds of technologies to communicate, so we don't need to be in the same physical space. And what this project was really interested in is how this shift towards virtual interaction is going to affect innovation. And we decided to look at innovation because we know that innovation thrives on collaboration. So when we bring people together from different perspectives and different backgrounds, that can help us be more creative, but also if we're cognitively entrenched, if we're stuck, it is helpful to bring other people in and hear their perspective to break out of the box. And traditionally, this collaboration happened face-to-face, right? We can go all the way back to the Greek Symposium, which is where the symposium comes from. And that's when people met face-to-face to share ideas. And since then, we've had professors work with students, dissertations in the same office space. We've had employees work together face-to-face, in the same meeting rooms. We've had labs like the Bell Labs be face-to-face. And so the question that we had when we embarked on this research was if we can replicate the magic when we're doing this on video. We know that collaboration works really well for creativity. Can we do this when we're interacting virtually? But because I'm a scientist and I'm approaching this from the angle of psychology, I wanted to define what I really meant by replicate the magic. And so I'm going to talk about early stage innovation today and how we think as psychologists the processes behind these different stages of innovation. And specifically, I focused on idea generation and then idea selection. And idea generation has been known to benefit from something called divergent thinking. So you want to be unfocused, unregulated, really expansive in your thinking. We heard about play earlier. That's can be really helpful for divergent thinking. But when it comes to idea selection, we actually benefit from something that we call convergent thinking. So we need to narrow in on what our best idea is, and that requires a more focused thinking process. It's more analytical, it's narrowing in. So we think of early stage innovation from a cognitive perspective as like this broadening out, expanding, having lots of things to play around with, and then idea selection to be more of this narrowing in, focusing in on which ideas actually have a lot of potential. And so we were interested in how interacting in person versus interacting virtually might affect both of these stages, this expansive divergent thinking process and this more narrowing convergent thinking process. Now, if you think about it, there's so many ways in which things or technologies like Zoom have mimicked or replicated in-person interaction. And so one possibility is there's not really that much difference. You can just take the exact same interaction that you would have in person, where a person is sitting across from you, and do that on Zoom, right? And there's reasons to think that because you can see the person's face, particularly if it's a one-on-one interaction. You can see their body language. You can hear what they're saying all in real time. And this isn't the case for past technologies like email, right? And so this is the first technology that really tries to mimic a face-to-face interaction. But we can all agree that trying to perfectly mimic what would happen in person on Zoom, it doesn't feel the same, right? You can't just perfectly mimic that. And so you're wondering, okay, well, what is the difference, given that there's so many things that are similar now to being in person, to being on technologies like Zoom? And we realize one important distinction between these two types of interaction is the extent of shared environment. So if you think we're all in this, in this Zoom meeting today, our shared environment is really just the screen in front of us, right? You don't really know what's in my broader environment. If I look over here, you don't know where I'm looking. We share this space of just the screen. And what we believe that would do is compel people to focus in on the screen, to look at the screen and not look at their surroundings, because their surroundings are not relevant to their interaction partner. And so if you're really engaged in interacting with the person on your video call, there's no reason to look anywhere other than the screen and maybe the camera. Now, what we know about visual focus is when you're focused in on the screen, that can affect your cognitive focus as well. So when you have these blinders on and you're ignoring your shared environment and just looking at the screen, that can end up making you more narrow and focused in your interactions. Now, that can be harmful for divergent thinking, right? Divergent thinking is expansive and broad and activating, lots of different things. And so being narrow and focused might end up constraining that process. But when it comes to convergent thinking, there's no reason why being visually focused and more, focused on the task would hurt your performance. If anything, maybe it could help. And so that's what we're interested in. Again, this situation where you're basically trying to mimic the exact same experiences you would have in person, but now you're having it on Zoom, and how that might affect your extent of shared environment, your visual focus, and then consequently your innovation. So we thought that virtual interaction might undermine idea generation, but not idea selection, because it's narrowing focus on the screen and making you more narrow in your thinking. So to test this, we ran a very simple lab experiment. Initially, we brought people into the lab, we randomly assigned them to pairs, and then we had them generate uses for a product. So frisbees in one case, and then bubble wrap in another. And we chose these just because everyone knows what these are. You don't have to have a certain expertise to come up with these ideas. And then they selected their most creative idea. And then we had a very bare bones design. And again, I want to go back to that this is not necessarily reflecting every possible way that we can interact remotely. It's really trying to get rid of anything else and say, okay, is there a fundamental difference between interacting in person versus interacting remotely? And understanding if there is, okay, then the next question is, what are some things we can do to counteract these differences that we observe? So we had people either face-to-face in this very blank, boring experimenter room, or we had a screen with their partner's face. And we actually got rid of the self view. So really, it was almost the exact same experience. Either you have a real live physical person in front of you, or you have a 15-inch screen display of that person's face instead. And again, we had them generate ideas, and then we had them select their ideas. So to look at how this affects innovation, we had to quantify what innovation is. So first, we took the ideas that people generated, and we gave them to judges, and we asked them to rate them on two different dimensions: novelty, so is it innovative, novel, and original, but also does it have value? Is it useful, effective, and implementable? And then we averaged these together to get a creativity score. And to look at idea generation, we just counted the total number of ideas that people came up with, and also number of creative ideas. And then for idea selection, we calculated two different ways. One way is to do a decision error score. You take, for each group, they have a certain number of ideas. What was the actual score of the top idea that people came up with? And then what was the score of the selected idea? And then we subtracted these. So a score of 0 means they actually selected their best idea. And as the decision error score grows, the more and more wrong they were in the idea they selected. And then we also just looked at the creativity of their selected idea. All right, so what did we find? Well, we found that virtual pairs generated fewer total ideas and fewer creative ideas than the in-person pairs. So simply just having a person sit in front of you in that space, rather than having a screen in front of you, resulted in fewer creative ideas from the team. But what's interesting is when we looked at idea selection, because one thing you could argue is, oh, people are just less familiar with Zoom or less familiar with video technology. And so of course, they're just going to be worse in general. But we don't find that they're worse in general. If anything, it seems like virtual pairs in our experiment were a little bit better at selecting their ideas. So the score of the selected idea that they picked was a little bit higher, and the decision error score was a little bit lower when people were interacting virtually. So why is this happening? As we mentioned, we think one really interesting difference between interacting in person and virtually is your shared environment and how that might affect your visual focus. And so to measure this, we had two different ways of capturing visual focus. One way was we populated a room with props. 5 of these props were relatively unexpected for a psychology lab room. So for example, we have like some fake lemons or like a skeleton system poster. And then we had participants work together in these rooms, either in the same physical space or in 2 different spaces. And then after they generate ideas and selected ideas, we asked them to recreate the room. Now, if people are less or more visually focused on the screen and focusing less on their environment, when they're interacting virtually, they should remember less of their space. They should be able to recall less of their environment. And that's indeed what we found, particularly for unexpected props. We found that people interacting virtually remembered fewer of the props around the room. And this is kind of an example, a little bit cherry picked to demonstrate, but how people were visualizing things virtually. It's just me and my partner on the screen versus when they're together in the same physical space, me and my partner in this full room. And if you look at this statistically, the recall of the unexpected items actually explains why the virtual condition was performing worse at idea generation. We also extracted eye gaze directly from the task computer. And so we're able to look at, are they looking at the task computer? Are they looking at their partner, which is the green here? Or are they looking at the surrounding room to see if there's differences in visual focus when we're interacting in person versus we're interacting remotely? And indeed, we find that. So again, people actually look at their partner more when they're interacting virtually than interacting in person. So sometimes people argue that there's maybe less connection when we're virtual, but if anything, people seem more engaged and more connected to their partner, looking at their partner much more virtually than in person. We don't find any difference for where they're looking at the task computer or not, but they look at the surrounding room substantially less when they're interacting virtually. And again, this statistically mediates our effects. So we find that when interacting virtually, looking at the room gaze a lot less, and the room gaze positively predicts idea generation performance. The more you're using your entire physical space and looking around, the more creative you end up being, but you do that less often when you're interacting virtually. So we did this in the lab. These are kind of silly tasks that are coming up with alternative uses for a product. And so we wanted to replicate it in at least one setting. And we were able to do this with a company, a telecom company with engineers. So again, these are people who are not necessarily trained in creative practices, but they do come up with lots of ideas for their company. So we had these big ideation workshops. We brought engineers together and they worked either face-to-face, like this room here, or they interacted remotely, again, in pairs of 2. And they came up with ideas for their company. So we did want to get beyond just the silly task of coming up with alternative uses for a product. The other nice thing here is they knew each other. So we want to make sure that the effects were not due to like when strangers are trying to interact online, maybe there's something specifically negative about that. And so these are employees who work together in teams, and they were assigned with someone that they should know at least somewhat well. And what we found was the exact same effect as when we studied this in the lab. When people are face to face in the same room, they're generating a larger number of ideas and a large number of creative ideas, and they're interacting remotely. And we found this effect across all these different countries where we ran the ideation workshops. So it doesn't seem to be a cultural difference. At least we don't have any evidence yet of that. We haven't really, captured every culture, obviously. But from the different countries that we observed, we did find this robust difference. But again, we found no difference in idea selection. If anything, they're a little bit better at idea selection when they're interacting virtually. So the actual top idea score was higher for in-person teams, but the score of the select idea didn't differ. And again, we find that the decision error score is higher for in-person teams as well. So I don't have much time left, so I think I'll just quickly say that we looked at a lot of alternative explanations, like how much you're connecting to your partner. We find no differences here, which I think is actually pretty remarkable. People are able to connect and feel like they're in sync with their partner just as much when they're interacting virtually as in person. So that isn't one of the barriers that we face when it comes to remote work. We are able to connect with people. We did look at also eye contact because it's impossible to actually look at someone's eyes, and that can affect how synchronous your communication is. You end up interrupting each other more often, and we do find evidence of that. People do have more crosstalk and have less speaker switches basically when we're talking remotely. But even controlling for these differences, we still observe an effect here. So overall, what we found here is just a small piece of the puzzle. And that's one of the reasons why I think that the symposium is so cool, because obviously there is a difference between interacting remotely versus in person. And so the question becomes, what can we do to overcome these problems of shared environment, or how can we maybe, add to this impoverished context that we looked at to really increase people's ability to divergently think and be expansive in their problem solving. So I just think it's really awesome that that's the problem that everyone's kind of approaching in this symposium. And thank you so much for your time as I shared this research.
Thank you, Melanie. Thanks for being a sport and helping us. Just really quickly, we do have a minute. Out of your study, if you had a curiosity or something that we could tweak, maybe a lens that we look through this, or a facet that we add as people submit their designs for the agenda that we might develop. Any curiosities from you, if you had to go back and do yours a little bit differently, or something you're interested to see how it might play out in a collaborative setting?
Yeah, I have a couple of different that I have thought about. One is the use of chat function. There is some work that shows that that can be really helpful for creativity, and we didn't look at that at all. And so being able to kind of use both of these things simultaneously is an advantage that remote work would have, a remote interaction. So I'm interested in that. I actually am also interested in the self view and how there could be some that could also help potentially. And I have no idea. No one's really looked at it before, and we got rid of the self view. So I'd be curious to see if that has a factor, if it's hurting creativity or helping. And I'd also be curious it's the extent to which we can create a sense of shared environment, even though that we're interacting virtually. What are some possibilities or ways to give us a sense of shared environment? But I'm also super excited to see what other people think as well.
Okay, yeah, that's great. I see. When you say shared environment, would a virtual whiteboard be an example of a shared environment?
I think so. I think that's one possibility of a shared environment. I also wondered the extent to which people share more about what space they're in, and have some kind of communication about where they are, and not just assume that the only thing that they're sharing is the screen, but having a better sense of like where people are physically present and how that might influence things as well.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Melanie. We really appreciate it.